Desert heat shimmered across the forward operating base like liquid mercury, distorting the horizon where sand met sky in an endless dance of mirages. Commander Jake Reaper Morrison had seen plenty of fobs in his 15 years with the SEALs, but this one felt different, charged with an electricity that had nothing to do with the 120-degree temperature or the constant threat of insurgent attacks. He'd arrived 3 days ago to assess the Joint Task Force's sniper operations, expecting the usual mix of military precision and battlefield chaos. What he hadn't expected was to find himself standing frozen in the doorway of the weapons maintenance shed, watching a figure in desert camouflage perform what could only be described as a ballet with a Barrett M82A1. The woman, and it took him a moment to process that it was indeed a woman, given the baggy fatigues and tactical vest that obscured her frame, moved with the kind of fluid precision that spoke of thousands of hours of practice. Her hands, small but steady as surgical instruments, disassembled the massive .50 caliber rifle with an efficiency that bordered on artistry. Each component was cleaned, inspected, and reassembled with the methodical care of someone who understood that in her line of work, a single grain of sand in the wrong place could mean the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. Morrison had handled plenty of Barrett rifles in his career. The M82A1 was a beast of a weapon, nearly 4 feet long, weighing close to 30 pounds when fully loaded, and capable of putting a .50 caliber round through an engine block at distances that defied belief. It wasn't a rifle you handed to just anyone. Hell, half the Marines he knew struggled with its recoil, and even fewer could consistently hit targets beyond 1,000 meters. Yet, here was this woman, treating the weapon like an extension of herself, her movements so natural they seemed choreographed. She was humming softly, something classical that he couldn't quite place but that seemed wildly incongruous with the industrial symphony of helicopters, generators, and distant gunfire that formed the constant soundtrack of life on the FOB. The melody drifted through the shed like smoke, adding an almost surreal quality to the scene. Her face was partially obscured by wraparound sunglasses and a tactical cap pulled low, but he could see enough to notice the sharp angle of her jawline, the way her lips moved silently as she counted components, the small scar that ran from her left ear toward the corner of her mouth, a mark that spoke of violence survived rather than accidents endured. What struck Morrison most wasn't her competence with the weapon, impressive as it was. It was the reverence in her touch, the way she handled each piece of the rifle as if it were a sacred relic rather than a tool of war. There was something almost spiritual about her process, a ritual that transcended mere maintenance. He'd seen plenty of operators clean their weapons. It was as fundamental to military life as breathing, but this was different. This was communion. The Barrett's barrel gleamed like obsidian in the harsh fluorescent lighting of the shed. She'd stripped it down to its essential components: the receiver, the bolt assembly, the muzzle brake that channeled the tremendous forces generated by the .50 BMG cartridge. Each piece lay arranged on the cleaning mat with geometric precision, creating patterns that spoke of a mind that found order in chaos, beauty in function. Her cleaning rod moved in long, smooth strokes down the barrel's length, and Morrison found himself mesmerized by the rhythm, the way her shoulders moved beneath the loose fabric of her uniform. A bead of sweat traced down her neck, disappearing beneath her collar, and Morrison realized he'd been standing there for nearly 5 minutes, transfixed. This wasn't like him. He was a professional, a man who'd earned his reputation through discipline and focus, not someone who got distracted by watching a soldier perform routine maintenance. Yet something about this scene held him captive. Perhaps it was the incongruity of finding such grace in a place defined by its brutality, or maybe it was the growing suspicion that he was witnessing something extraordinary disguised as ordinary. The woman's movements never faltered, never hesitated. Her muscle memory was so complete that she could have performed this ritual blindfolded, in complete darkness, under enemy fire. Morrison had seen that level of familiarity before, but only in operators who lived and breathed their craft, who had moved beyond simple competence into the realm of artistry. Navy SEALs, Delta Force operators, Marine Force recon, the elite of the elite. But even among that rarefied company, few achieved this level of symbiosis with their weapons. She began reassembling the Barrett with the same measured precision, each component sliding into place with barely audible clicks and snaps. The bolt assembly went home with a sound like thunder being swallowed by the desert. The barrel locked into the receiver with mechanical finality. The bipod legs extended and retracted in smooth arcs that spoke of perfect maintenance and infinite repetition. It was hypnotic, this dance of metal and flesh, of human intention and mechanical precision. Morrison's eyes moved from her hands to the cleaning mat, where he noticed something that made his breath catch in his throat. Scratched into the leather surface were dozens of small marks. Hash marks, he realized, each one representing something significant. They were grouped in clusters, some faded with age, others sharp and fresh. Kill marks, perhaps, though their exact meaning remained unclear. What was clear was their number, far more than any sniper should reasonably accumulate in a single deployment, more than most accumulated in entire careers. The classical melody she'd been humming shifted to something more complex, a piece that seemed to weave through major and minor keys with the fluidity of smoke. Mozart, he thought, though he couldn't be certain. The incongruity struck him again. This warrior poet who found music in violence, who brought art to the science of death. There was a story here, layers of meaning that spoke to experiences he couldn't begin to imagine. As she worked, Morrison found himself studying her more closely, looking for clues to her identity and background. Her fatigues bore no name tape, no unit patches, no rank insignia, the kind of anonymous uniform worn by operators whose very existence was classified. Her boots were well worn but meticulously maintained, the leather scarred by countless miles but still holding their shape. Her hands, he noticed, bore the calluses of someone who spent serious time behind a rifle, thick deposits of hardened skin along her trigger finger and thumb, marks that spoke of thousands upon thousands of rounds fired. But it was her posture that really gave her away, the way she held herself with that particular combination of relaxation and readiness that marked true professionals. Her spine was straight but not rigid, her shoulders loose but prepared to absorb recoil, her breathing deep and controlled. This was someone who had learned to find stillness in chaos, to maintain perfect calm while dealing death from impossible distances. Morrison had seen that same bearing in himself, in his fellow SEALs, in the handful of operators who had transcended mere training to achieve something approaching transcendence. The Barrett came together under her hands like a puzzle, solving itself, each piece finding its destined place with inevitability that suggested deeper forces at work. The final component, the massive muzzle brake that channeled the rifle's tremendous recoil, slid home with a sound like destiny being fulfilled. She ran her hands along the weapon's length one final time, checking for any imperfection, any flaw that might compromise its performance. Finding none, she allowed herself the smallest of smiles, the expression that transformed her face from professional competence to something approaching beauty. Morrison felt his heart rate accelerate, a response that had nothing to do with adrenaline and everything to do with recognition. This wasn't just any sniper maintaining her weapon. This was someone operating at the absolute pinnacle of her profession, someone whose skills bordered on the superhuman. The question that burned in his mind wasn't who she was. He had a growing suspicion about that, but rather what she was doing here in this remote corner of Afghanistan, surrounded by conventional forces who likely had no idea what kind of predator walked among them. The woman stood and stretched, her movement causing her uniform to pull tight for just a moment, revealing hints of the athlete beneath the baggy fabric. She was smaller than Morrison had initially thought, probably no more than 5'6", but there was a coiled energy about her that suggested explosive potential. Like a compressed spring, all that power held in check until the moment it was needed. She began gathering her cleaning supplies with the same methodical precision she'd applied to the rifle, each tool finding its designated place in her kit with practiced ease. It was then that Morrison noticed the small notebook lying beside her cleaning mat. The cover was weathered leather, scarred by sand and time, and he could see pages of handwritten notes through the gaps where it had fallen open. Numbers, mostly, ranges, wind calculations, environmental factors, but also sketches of terrain features, target reference points, and what looked like philosophical observations written in margins. The handwriting was precise, feminine, yet somehow fierce in its intensity. Without warning, she spoke. "You planning to stand there all day, Commander, or did you actually need something?" Her voice was like whiskey over broken glass, smooth but with an edge that suggested depths of experience Morrison could only guess at. She hadn't turned around, hadn't given any indication she'd been aware of his presence. Yet she'd known he was there, known his rank too, which meant she'd done her homework on the new arrival. The hair on the back of Morrison's neck stood up, a primitive response to being observed by a predator who had chosen not to strike. "Just admiring the workmanship," he replied, stepping into the shed and letting his eyes adjust to the contrast between desert glare and artificial light. "That's some serious hardware you've got there." She turned then, and Morrison got his first clear look at her face. High cheekbones that could cut glass, eyes the color of winter storms behind those, wraparound shades, skin tanned to leather by sun and wind. She was beautiful in the way that dangerous things are beautiful. Sharp edges and hidden depths, promises of both pleasure and pain. But it was her smile that stopped him cold, an expression that managed to be both welcoming and predatory, like a cat deciding whether to play with its prey or simply devour it. "Barrett M82A1, she said, running one hand along the rifle's stock with casual familiarity. "Semi-automatic anti-materiel rifle, 50 BMG cartridge, effective range of 1800 meters for point targets, though in the right hands." She paused, letting the implication hang in the air like smoke. "Well, let's just say the manufacturer's specifications can be somewhat conservative." Morrison felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning unit rattling in the corner of the shed. Those words, delivered with such casual confidence, suggested capabilities that defied conventional understanding of long-range marksmanship. 1,800 meters was already beyond the effective range of most military snipers, a distance that required not just exceptional skill, but also perfect conditions and a fair amount of luck. To suggest that she could consistently exceed, those parameters spoke to abilities that bordered on the supernatural. "You seem to know your way around it," he said, keeping his voice neutral despite the growing excitement he felt. This was it, he realized, the extraordinary thing he'd sensed from the moment he'd arrived at the FOB. This woman, whoever she was, represented something beyond normal military operations, beyond conventional warfare. She was a weapon in human form, a tool of precision violence so advanced that her very existence challenged everything Morrison thought he knew about the art of war. Her smile widened, showing teeth that were perfectly straight and white as desert bone. "You could say that, though I prefer to think of it as a collaboration rather than simple familiarity. The rifle and I, we understand each other. We speak the same language." The way she said it sent another chill down Morrison's spine. There was something almost mystical in her tone, a suggestion that her relationship with the weapon transcended the merely mechanical. He'd known operators who developed strong attachments to their gear, but this sounded different, deeper, more fundamental. As if the Barrett wasn't just a tool she used, but an extension of her very being, a manifestation of her will made manifest in steel and precision engineering. Morrison was about to respond when the sharp crack of incoming mortars shattered the desert calm. The first explosion hit the motor pool, sending a column of black smoke spiraling into the crystalline sky, The second and third rounds followed in rapid succession, walking across the base with the methodical precision of someone who had studied the layout extensively. Alarm klaxons began their mechanical screaming, and voices shouted orders across the compound as personnel scrambled for defensive positions. But the woman didn't move. She stood there, completely motionless, her head tilted slightly as if listening to music only she could hear. Morrison's training kicked in, and he grabbed her arm to pull her toward the nearest bunker. The moment his fingers made contact with her sleeve, she moved with liquid speed that defied physics. 1 second, she was standing beside her cleaning station. The next, she had his wrist locked in a grip that could snap bone, her body positioned to deliver a killing blow with surgical precision. "Don't," she said softly, her voice carrying the same casual tone she might use to comment on the weather. "I'm listening." Morrison found himself staring into eyes that had removed their sunglasses sometime during the attack, revealing irises the color of Arctic ice flecked with silver. They were the coldest eyes he'd ever seen, devoid of fear, panic, or even basic human concern for survival. They were predator's eyes, calculating and patient, focused on something far beyond the immediate chaos surrounding them. Another mortar round impacted near the communications center, close enough that Morrison could feel the concussion in his chest. Debris rained down on the shed's corrugated roof like hail, and the lights flickered ominously. Still, the woman didn't flinch. Her grip on his wrist remained steady, not painful but absolutely unbreakable, while her free hand moved to rest on the Barrett's pistol grip with the casual familiarity of a pianist touching keys. 7 mortars, she said, her voice cutting through the chaos with eerie clarity. 81 millimeter, Chinese manufacture, probably fired from grid reference. 774-291, approximately 4,000 meters northeast of our position. Crew of 3, 1 spotter with optics, 2 serving the tube. They've been watching us for at least 72 hours to get their ranging this precise. Morrison felt his mouth go dry. The accuracy of her assessment, delivered without any apparent effort or consultation with instruments, suggested capabilities that bordered on the supernatural. She was calling out technical specifications and tactical analysis while mortar rounds exploded around them, as if she were reading from a training manual rather than living through a coordinated attack. "How the hell can you possibly know?" he began. But she released his wrist and raised 1 finger to her lips, a gesture that somehow carried more authority than any shouted order he'd ever received. The base's counter-battery radar would be spinning up now, Morrison knew, trying to backtrack the incoming rounds to their point of origin. It was a sophisticated system that took precious minutes to acquire, calculate, and coordinate a response. By the time the 155 mm howitzers got into action, the insurgent mortar crew would be long gone, melted back into the maze of villages and wadis that provided perfect cover in this godforsaken landscape. But the woman was already moving, her hands flowing over the Barrett with the same fluid precision he'd witnessed during her cleaning ritual. The bipod legs extended with mechanical precision, finding purchase on the shed's concrete floor. Her right hand worked the bolt with a motion so smooth it seemed choreographed, chambering around with a sound like thunder being born. The massive rifle came up to her shoulder as if it weighed nothing at all, and Morrison realized he was about to witness something that would redefine his understanding of what was humanly possible. "Grid 774291, she murmured, her voice taking on the same sing-song quality he'd heard when she was humming classical music. Wind from the southwest at 12 knots, temperature 120 degrees Fahrenheit, barometric. Pressure 29.87 and falling. Humidity 18%, elevation difference approximately 300 meters. She was calling out environmental factors with the precision of a meteorological station, her voice never rising above a conversational tone despite the ongoing bombardment. Morrison watched in fascination as her breathing slowed, became deeper, and more controlled. Her heart rate, he realized, was actually decreasing even as explosions continued to rock the base around them. She was entering some kind of altered state, a zone of perfect calm and concentration that allowed her to function, at levels that transcended normal human capability. The Barrett's scope was a work of art in itself, a piece of precision optics that cost more than most people's cars. Morrison could see her making minute adjustments to the elevation and windage turrets, each click representing calculations that would have taken him minutes to work out with instruments. She was doing it all in her head, processing variables and environmental factors with the speed and accuracy of a supercomputer. Distance to target, 4,137 meters, she continued, her voice now barely above. A whisper. Projectile flight time, 4.3 seconds. Target will be exposed for approximately 6 seconds during next fire mission. Morrison felt the world tilt on its axis. 4,000 meters. Over 2.5 miles. At that distance, the curvature of the Earth became a factor in ballistic calculations. Atmospheric conditions could deflect a bullet by meters. The margin for error was measured in millimeters, and she was talking about engaging a target she couldn't possibly see with naked eyes, using data she'd somehow calculated without instruments, in conditions that would challenge the world's best military snipers. But it wasn't just the technical impossibility of what she was proposing that stunned him. It was the casual confidence with which she approached it, as if shooting at targets beyond the horizon was just another day at the office. There was something almost supernatural about her composure, a suggestion that she operated according to rules that didn't apply to ordinary mortals. The 8th mortar round landed near the ammunition depot, and Morrison could see personnel running, for cover behind concrete barriers and sandbag walls. The base's defensive systems were coming online now. He could hear the distinctive whine of the Phalanx CIWS system spinning up, and somewhere in the distance, the deeper rumble of Bradley, fighting vehicles moving to intercept potential ground assault. It was chaos orchestrated, violence managed by training and discipline, but still fundamentally reactive. The woman, by contrast, had become the eye of the storm. Around her, the world exploded and burned and bled, but she remained perfectly still, perfectly calm, a figure of absolute serenity in the midst of absolute chaos. The Barrett had become part of her now, an extension of her will made manifest in steel and precision engineering. Morrison could see her pulse in the side of her neck, slow, steady, the rhythm of someone in complete control of her autonomic nervous system. Target acquired, she said, and Morrison realized she was looking at something he couldn't even imagine seeing. At 4,000 meters, a human being would be invisible to naked eyes, lost in heat shimmer and atmospheric distortion. Even with the scope, the technical challenges were staggering. She would have to account for wind drift across more than 4 kilometers of desert air, for the bullets drop over that impossible distance, for the Earth's rotation affecting the projectiles. Flight path. It was a shot that belonged in the realm of theoretical ballistics rather than practical marksmanship. But her breathing had stopped entirely now, that final moment of perfect stillness that marked the transition from preparation to execution. Morrison had seen this before, in himself and in other operators, but never to this degree. She had achieved a state of absolute quiet, perfect harmony between intention and capability. The Barrett seemed to pulse with potential energy, as if the rifle itself understood what was about to happen. The trigger break was so subtle that Morrison almost missed it. There was no dramatic pause, no ceremonial moment of commitment. One instant, the round was in the chamber. The next, it was screaming across the desert at nearly 3,000 feet per second, carrying with it the accumulated skill and will of the most dangerous human being Morrison had ever encountered. The rifle's recoil was tremendous, enough to knock most shooters off balance even with the Barrett's sophisticated muzzle brake and recoil system. But the woman absorbed the energy like a shock absorber, her body moving with the weapon's motion, channeling the violence into the concrete floor beneath her feet. She was already working the bolt, chambering a second round, her movements as smooth and automatic as breathing. "Impact in 3 seconds," she said, her voice carrying the same casual tone she might use to announce dinner was ready. Morrison found himself holding his breath, waiting for confirmation of something that defied every law of physics and probability he understood. 4,000 meters, in combat conditions. With a target she couldn't possibly see clearly. It was madness disguised as precision, impossibility wrapped in the mundane mechanics of trigger pull and ballistic trajectory. The silence stretched between them like a taut wire, punctuated by the ongoing explosions and chaos of the mortar attack. Morrison realized he was witnessing something that would haunt his dreams for the rest of his life. A display of human capability that challenged everything he thought he knew about the limits of skill and training. This wasn't just expert marksmanship. This was something approaching art, or magic, or both. "Hit," she said simply, and chambered another round. "Spot her down," adjusting for secondary target. Morrison felt his knees go weak. She'd done it. At a distance that should have been impossible, under conditions that would challenge a computer-controlled weapon system, she'd put a .50 caliber round exactly where she intended it to go. But even as he struggled to process the implications of what he'd just witnessed, she was already engaging the next target, her movements flowing with the same mechanical precision that had characterized her rifle maintenance. The second shot came less than 30 seconds after the first, the Barrett's thunder rolling across the desert like divine judgment. Morrison could see personnel throughout the base stopping their frantic defensive preparations, turning to stare in the direction of the weapons shed where impossible things were happening with casual regularity. Even the mortars had stopped, falling, as if the insurgent crew was beginning to understand that they were no longer the hunters, but the hunted. "Second target down," the woman reported, her voice carrying no more emotion than if she were announcing the temperature, adjusting for final target. But the third shot never came. The mortar attack simply stopped, the desert falling into an eerie quiet that seemed louder than the explosions had been. Morrison could hear his own heartbeat, could smell the acrid smoke of high explosive mixed with the gun oil and metal scent of the recently fired Barrett. The woman lowered the rifle, her movements as controlled and precise as everything else about her, and began the process of making the weapon safe. 3 targets at 41-37 meters, she said, finally turning to look at Morrison with those impossibly cold eyes. "Engagement time, 97 seconds. Ammunition expended, 2 rounds. She paused, and that predatory smile returned to her lips. I was feeling generous today. The silence that followed was broken by the thunderous roar of approaching helicopters. Apaches, from the sound of their rotors, coming in hot to investigate what their thermal imaging systems would show as an impossible series of heat signatures, where living human beings had been reduced to cooling meat. Morrison watched the woman begin her post-engagement ritual, checking the Barrett's chamber, inspecting the bolt face, running her hands along the barrel with the same reverence she'd shown during cleaning. It was as if the act of killing at impossible distances was just another form of maintenance, another way of communing with her weapon. "Who the hell are you?" Morrison finally managed, his voice barely above a whisper. The question hung in the air between them like smoke, weighted with implications that reached far beyond simple curiosity. He'd spent his entire adult life in the special operations community, had worked alongside Delta Force operators, Marine Scout snipers, Army Rangers, and foreign special forces from a dozen countries. He knew the capabilities of the world's most elite warriors, understood the theoretical limits of human marksmanship. What he'd just witnessed existed in a realm beyond those limits, in a space where the possible and impossible intersected. She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she opened that weathered leather notebook Morrison had noticed earlier, withdrawing a pencil stub that had been worn down to barely 3 inches of wood and graphite. With the same methodical precision she applied to everything else, she began making entries: time, distance, environmental conditions, ammunition type, target description. Her handwriting was small and precise, each letter formed with the care of someone for whom documentation was a sacred ritual. 2 more, she said, adding hash marks to the collection already scratched into her cleaning mat. The marks now numbered in the hundreds, Morrison realized, maybe thousands. Each one representing a life ended at impossible distances, a moment when her will and the Barrett's precision had reached across miles of desert air to deliver final judgment. Brings my total to 4,731 confirmed eliminations. Morrison felt the world shift beneath his feet. 4,000. The number was so far beyond anything he'd imagined that it took several seconds for his mind to process it. The most successful snipers in military history, Simo Heha, Carlos Hathcock, Chris Kyle, their confirmed kill counts were measured in the hundreds, not thousands. What she was claiming represented decades of constant warfare, an entire career spent behind a scope, dealing death with mathematical precision. "That's not possible," he said, but even as the words left his mouth he knew they were hollow. He'd just watched her engage targets at a distance that should have been impossible, using skills that transcended normal human capability. The evidence of his senses warred with everything he thought he knew about warfare, about human limitations, about the basic laws of physics. She looked up from her notebook, and for the first time, he saw something almost like amusement in those Arctic eyes. Commander Morrison, United States Navy SEALs, 15 years of service, 47 confirmed eliminations, distinguished service in Iraq, Afghanistan, and Syria. Divorced, no children, lives alone in a 1-bedroom apartment in Virginia Beach, when not deployed. You drink too much, sleep too little, and dream about the 12 men you killed in close-quarters combat because their faces haunt you in ways the long-distance kills never did. Morrison's blood turned to ice water. The personal details were classified, buried in personnel files that required clearances beyond top secret to access. But it wasn't just the information itself that shook him. It was the casual, almost bored way she recited facts about his life, as if she were reading from a grocery list rather than revealing knowledge that could only have come from the deepest levels of military intelligence. "How do you—" he began, but she was already continuing, her voice taking on the same sing-song quality he'd heard during her environmental calculations. "The 47 doesn't include the 3 Taliban fighters you killed with a knife in Kandahar, or the bomb maker you strangled with your bare hands in Mosul. You don't count those because you were so close you could smell their breath, could see the fear in their eyes. Those kills felt personal, felt wrong, even though they were perfectly justified tactically. The long-distance eliminations are easier to live with because they feel clean, surgical, removed from the messiness of human emotion." Morrison found himself backing toward the shed's entrance, his hand instinctively moving toward the sidearm on his hip. This woman knew things about him that he'd never told anyone, psychological details that lived in the darkest corners of his mind. It was impossible unless she had access to resources that existed far beyond normal military intelligence, unless she was connected to organizations that operated in spaces where the normal rules didn't apply. "You're wondering if you should draw your weapon," she continued, not even looking up from her notebook as she continued making entries. "You're calculating angles of fire, assessing your chances of getting a clean shot before I can bring the Barrett to bear. But you already know it's pointless. I'm not your enemy, Commander. I'm something much more interesting than that." "Ihiun." Sound of boots on concrete interrupted their conversation as a squad of Marines burst through the shed's entrance, weapons raised, eyes wide with the particular alertness that came from surviving an attack they didn't fully understand. Their squad leader, a gunnery sergeant with 20 years of desert warfare etched into the lines around his eyes, swept the interior with his rifle before focusing on Morrison. "Sir, we need to evacuate this position immediately. Intelligence indicates possible follow-up attacks and—" The Marine stopped mid-sentence as his eyes fell on the woman and her Barrett. Something in his expression changed, a shift from professional alertness to something approaching awe. Holy shit, you're Ghost. The woman, Ghost, finally looked up from her notebook, and Morrison saw her smile again, that same predatory expression that seemed to contain multitudes of secrets. "Hello, Gunny. It's been a while." The Marine sergeant's weapon lowered slightly, though his grip remained steady. "Ma'am, we thought you were... after Helmand Province, the reports said..." He trailed off, apparently uncertain how to finish the sentence without revealing classified information. "That I was dead?" Ghost asked, her tone carrying just a hint of amusement. That was the idea. Death is quite liberating, actually. It frees you from all sorts of bureaucratic constraints. Morrison felt pieces of a larger puzzle beginning to fall into place, though the picture they formed was more terrifying than illuminating. Ghost wasn't just any operator, she was legend, myth, the kind of figure that existed in whispered stories told around forward operating bases from Afghanistan to Syria. He'd heard fragments of those stories over the years. A female sniper who could engage targets beyond the horizon, who had supposedly died in an IED attack 3 years ago, whose confirmed kill count was classified at levels that suggested government, embarrassment rather than national security. "The record," Morrison said, his voice barely above a whisper. "The 3,247-meter shot. That was you." Ghost's smile widened, revealing teeth that seemed too white, too perfect, like a predator's dental display. "Ah, you've heard about that one. Most people get the distance wrong, actually. It was 3,247 meters, but the conditions were challenging." She stood and walked to the shed's window, gazing out at the desert landscape where heat mirages danced like spirits in the afternoon sun. When she spoke again, her voice carried a distant quality, as if she were looking not at the present landscape, but at some other place, some other time where impossible things became routine. Zabul Province, 3 years ago. High-value target. Taliban commander who'd been coordinating attacks against civilian targets. Intel placed him in a compound that our ground forces couldn't approach without significant casualties. The shot was complicated. Morrison found himself leaning forward despite his better judgment, drawn into her narrative like a moth to flame. The Marine squad had taken defensive positions around the shed's perimeter, but their body language suggested they were as much audience as security. Even hardened combat veterans, it seemed, were not immune to the gravitational pull of legend. "Complications," Morrison prompted. Ghost turned back to face him, and her eyes seemed to hold depths that stretched beyond the physical confines of the shed, beyond the desert, beyond the immediate geography of war. The target was moving, not just walking. He was riding in the back of a technical, bouncing across terrain that would challenge a mountain goat. Wind was gusting to 25 knots from multiple directions. Temperature differential between my position and the target area was 43 degrees. And I had approximately 90 seconds before his convoy disappeared into a valley where we'd lose them for good. She moved back to the Barrett, running her hands along its length with the same reverence Morrison had observed earlier. The rifle seemed to respond to her touch, as if the metal itself recognized its master's presence. The mathematics were daunting. Projectile flight time of 4.7 seconds over constantly changing terrain, with a target moving at 37 kilometers per hour in an unpredictable pattern. The margin for error was measured in millimeters. Morrison did quick calculations in his head and felt his mouth go dry. A moving target at over 3 kilometers in high wind, with massive temperature differentials affecting air density. It wasn't just an impossible shot, it was a shot that violated the basic principles of ballistic science. Even with perfect conditions and a stationary target, 3,247 meters would challenge the world's most sophisticated weapon systems. "But you took it anyway," he said. "I took it anyway," Ghost confirmed. "Because sometimes impossible is just another word for necessary. Sometimes the mathematics of war require solutions that exist outside the parameters of what we think we know about physics." The gunny sergeant cleared his throat, drawing their attention back to the present moment. "Ma'am, with respect, we really do need to consider evacuation. Intelligence suggests the mortar attack was reconnaissance by fire, testing our response capabilities for a larger assault." Ghost nodded absently, though her attention seemed focused on something beyond the immediate tactical situation. "Of course, Gunny, but I think we can assume the reconnaissance phase is complete now. They've learned what they wanted to know." Morrison felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. "What do you mean?" Ghost's smile returned, and this time it carried implications that made Morrison's skin crawl. "I mean, Commander, that the mortar attack wasn't random harassment. It was specifically designed to make me reveal myself, to demonstrate my capabilities to someone who would report back to very interested parties. Parties who thought I was dead and are now quite eager to confirm otherwise." The pieces clicked together in Morrison's mind with sickening clarity. The perfectly ranged mortar rounds, the precision timing, the fact that the attack had ceased. The moment Ghost engaged. It hadn't been a standard insurgent harassment operation. It had been a test, a carefully orchestrated event designed to draw out a ghost and prove that legends could still bleed. "They're coming for you," Morrison said. "Oh yes," Ghost replied, chambering another round in the Barrett with mechanical precision. "They're coming for me. The only question is how many of them I can kill before they realize that some ghosts are much more dangerous when they're angry." The attack came at sunset, when the desert light turned everything to blood and shadow, when thermal imaging became unreliable and human vision struggled to distinguish between mirages and reality. Morrison should have seen it coming. The timing was too perfect, too precisely calculated to be coincidental. But even with his 15 years of combat experience, he wasn't prepared for the coordinated efficiency of what unfolded across the forward operating base like a carefully choreographed dance of death. They came from 3 directions simultaneously. A mechanized assault from the north featuring technical vehicles mounted with heavy machine guns, a dismounted infantry attack from the east using the Wadi system for concealment, and, most sophisticated of all, a helicopter-borne insertion from the south that spoke of resources and planning far beyond typical insurgent capabilities. These weren't Taliban fighters armed with AK-47s and improvised explosives. These were professionals, equipped with night vision, body armor, and weapons that belonged in the arsenals of nation-states rather than terrorist cells. Morrison found himself crouched beside Ghost in what had become an improvised fighting position. The weapons she'd transformed into a fortress of sandbags and steel plates that the Marine Engineering Section had somehow materialized in the 4 hours since the mortar attack. The Barrett lay across a custom-built rest, its massive barrel protruding, through a firing port that had been precisely calculated to provide maximum field of view while minimizing exposure. Ghost herself had barely moved during the frantic preparations, sitting with the patience of a spider in its web, occasionally making minute adjustments to her scope or checking environmental conditions with instruments that seemed to appear from hidden pockets in her uniform. 17 vehicles in the Northern Assault Group, she said, her voice carrying the same conversational tone she might use to discuss the weather. Mixed technical and armored vehicles, approximately 60 personnel. Eastern approach, 23 fighters using fire and maneuver tactics, probably former Iraqi army based on their movement patterns. Southern insertion, 2 helicopters, 12, operators per bird, advanced equipment and training. Morrison stared at her through the gathering darkness, trying to process how she could possibly have acquired such detailed intelligence on forces that were still several kilometers away and largely invisible to conventional observation. The base's surveillance systems were sophisticated, but they couldn't provide the kind of precise tactical assessment she was delivering with casual confidence. "How can you possibly—" he began, but she raised one finger to her lips again, that same gesture that somehow carried more authority than a shouted command. "The northern group will hit our perimeter in approximately 7 minutes, she continued, apparently oblivious to his question. "They're expecting heavy resistance from that direction. It's where they'd position their best defenses if they were designing this base. The eastern approach will coordinate their assault to begin 90 seconds later, drawing our attention and reserves away from the north. The helicopter insertion will commence during the height of the ground assault, landing their special operations team directly on the command center. Morrison felt pieces of the tactical picture falling into place with sickening clarity. This wasn't just a coordinated attack, it was a masterpiece of military planning, designed to overwhelm the base's defenses through precise timing and multiple vectors of assault. More troubling still was the implication that whoever was directing this operation had intimate knowledge of the FOB's defensive arrangements, suggesting intelligence penetration at levels that should have been impossible. "They know the base layout," he said. "They know our defensive positions, our response protocols, our equipment." Ghost nodded absently, her attention focused on something only she could see through the Barrett's scope. "Of course they do. They've been planning this operation for months, waiting for confirmation that I was alive. The mortar attack this morning was the final piece of their puzzle, proof that the ghost had substance, that the legend could still bleed." The first explosions came exactly when she'd predicted. Massive detonations that lit the northern perimeter with orange fire and sent shockwaves rolling across the desert floor like thunder. Morrison could see tracer rounds beginning to arc across the darkening sky, the distinctive green streaks of Soviet bloc ammunition mixing with the red tracers of NATO weapons in a deadly light show that painted the night in primary colors of violence. But Ghost remained perfectly still, perfectly calm, a figure of absolute serenity in the midst of escalating chaos. The Barrett's scope tracked slowly across the eastern approaches, and Morrison realized she was looking for something specific, some particular target that existed beyond the immediate tactical situation. Her breathing had slowed again, entering that zone of perfect control he'd witnessed during the mortar engagement. "Target acquisition," she murmured, her voice barely audible above the growing symphony of gunfire and explosions. "Eastern approach, grid reference 773842, range 2,100 meters. High-value individual, probably the assault commander, directing fire from a concealed position behind that ridgeline." Morrison squinted through his own optics, trying to see what she was seeing. At 2,100 meters in fading light, with smoke and dust beginning to obscure the battlefield, he could make out general terrain features but nothing that resembled a human target. Yet Ghost was tracking something with the precision of a hunting hawk, her movements minimal but absolutely purposeful. "I can't see anything," Morrison admitted. "Muzzle flash from his binoculars," Ghost replied. "Zeiss Optics, German manufacture, probably military issue. He's using them to coordinate fire missions, exposing his position every time he adjusts his viewing angle. Amateur mistake for someone with his apparent resources." The battlefield was evolving exactly as she'd predicted. The northern assault had engaged the base's primary defensive positions, drawing the majority of available personnel into a grinding firefight that consumed ammunition and attention with equal veracity. The eastern attack had commenced on schedule, forcing the remaining reserves to split their focus between multiple threats. And somewhere in the darkness to the south, Morrison knew 2 helicopters were approaching with passengers whose intentions were significantly more personal than strategic. Ghost's finger found the Barrett's trigger, and Morrison held his breath, without realizing it. This shot would be different from the morning's engagement. Longer range, worse conditions, a target that was actively trying not to be seen. It was the kind of shot that separated legends from mere mortals, the kind of impossible achievement that transformed human beings into myths. The trigger broke with mechanical precision, and the Barrett's recoil was absorbed into Ghost's body, with the fluid grace of water flowing downhill. Morrison watched the muzzle flash blossom like a deadly flower, saw the massive .50 caliber projectile disappear into the darkness, carrying with it the accumulated skill and will of the most dangerous human being he'd ever encountered. Impact in 2.4 seconds, Ghost said, already working the bolt to chamber another round. Eastern assault coordination should collapse in approximately 30 seconds as subordinate commanders realize they're operating without higher direction. Morrison counted off the seconds in his head, watching the eastern approaches through his own optics. At exactly 30 seconds, the coordinated fire patterns began to break down. Individual fighters started taking cover instead of advancing, their movements becoming reactive rather than purposeful. The assault that had been a precisely orchestrated advance transformed into a confused collection of isolated engagements. But Ghost was already tracking new targets, the Barrett swinging toward the northern battle line with mechanical precision. Morrison could see her lips moving silently, running calculations that existed beyond his understanding, processing variables and environmental factors with the speed and accuracy of a weapons computer. The scope's crosshairs settled on something, invisible to his eyes, and her breathing stopped entirely. The second shot followed less than 90 seconds after the first, the Barrett's thunder rolling across the desert like divine judgment. Morrison watched another command position dissolve into chaos as whoever had been coordinating the northern assault suddenly ceased to exist. The attacking vehicles began to scatter, their previously coordinated advance becoming a disorganized retreat as subordinate leaders tried to figure out what had happened to their tactical coherence. 2 down, Ghost reported, her voice carrying no more emotion than if she were announcing the time, adjusting for helicopter insertion. Morrison turned his attention to the southern approaches, where his ears had finally picked up the distinctive sound of rotor blades cutting through desert air. The helicopters were coming in fast and low, using terrain features to mask their approach until the last possible moment. These weren't the clumsy transport birds favored by insurgent forces. These were military aircraft, probably Black Hawks or their foreign equivalents, carrying passengers whose capabilities matched their expensive transportation. Range to helicopter landing zone, 800 meters, Ghost continued, her scope tracking across terrain that Morrison couldn't even see clearly. 2 birds, 12 operators per aircraft, advanced equipment and training. Primary target will be the lead bird's passenger compartment. Eliminate the assault team before they can disembark. 800 meters to a moving helicopter in near darkness, with the target constantly changing position and altitude. Morrison had seen military snipers struggle with stationary targets at half that range under perfect conditions. What Ghost was proposing existed in the realm of theoretical ballistics rather than practical marksmanship. But her breathing had already stopped, her body entering that state of perfect stillness that marked the transition from preparation to execution. The Barrett's crosshairs tracked the lead helicopter's approach with mechanical precision, leading the target by margins that existed only in Ghost's inhuman calculations. Morrison found himself holding his breath again, waiting for confirmation of something that challenged every assumption he'd ever made about human capability. The third shot came as the helicopter flared for landing, its passenger compartment exposed for the briefest moment as the aircraft transitioned from forward flight to hover. The Barrett's .50 caliber projectile crossed 800 meters of desert air in less than a second, carrying with it the accumulated fury of a ghost who had been hunted back into the world of the living. The helicopter's passenger compartment exploded in a shower of sparks and debris, the massive round punching through armored glass and military-grade protection as if they were tissue paper. The aircraft lurched sideways, its pilot fighting to maintain control as whatever remained of the assault team ceased to be a tactical factor. The second helicopter immediately broke off its approach, climbing rapidly away from an engagement that had suddenly become far more dangerous than anticipated. Ghost was already tracking the retreating aircraft, her scope following its climb with predatory patience. Range increasing to 1,200 meters, she reported, target still within engagement envelope. But she didn't take the shot. Instead, she watched the helicopter disappear into the darkness, carrying with it survivors who would report back to their masters about capabilities that existed beyond normal human parameters. Morrison realized this was intentional. Ghost wanted someone to escape, wanted word to spread about what had happened here. "Why did you let them go?" Morrison asked. Ghost's smile returned, and in the darkness it seemed to glow with its own internal light. "Because, Commander, sometimes the most effective way to end a war is to make your enemies understand that continuing it would be suicidal. Those men will report back about what they witnessed here, about capabilities that exist beyond their understanding, about a ghost who turned out to be much more dangerous than they imagined." The battlefield was falling quiet now, the various assault groups melting back into the desert darkness from which they'd emerged. The FOB's defensive systems had held, but Morrison knew the real victory belonged to the woman beside him, whose impossible marksmanship had decapitated 3 coordinated attacks with surgical precision. "Who were they?" Morrison asked. "Who goes to this kind of effort to confirm that one person is alive?" Ghost began the process of making her weapons safe, her movements as controlled and precise as everything else about her. "Organizations that prefer their legends to remain safely dead, Commander. Agencies that find living ghosts inconvenient for their ongoing operations." She stood and stretched, her movement causing her uniform to pull tight for just a moment, revealing hints of the warrior beneath the baggy fabric. "But they've learned something important tonight. They've learned that some ghosts become more dangerous when you try to put them back in their graves." Morrison felt the pieces of a much larger puzzle beginning to fall into place, though the picture they formed raised more questions than it answered. Ghost wasn't just a sniper who had faked her own death. She was someone whose very existence threatened powerful interests, someone whose skills had made her as much a liability as an asset to the people who had created her. "What happens now?" he asked. Ghost shouldered her Barrett with casual ease, the massive weapon seeming to weigh nothing in her hands. "Now, Commander, I disappear again, but this time everyone will know that the ghost is still out there, still watching, still capable of reaching across impossible distances to deliver final judgment. And that knowledge will make certain people very, very careful about the choices they make in the future." She walked toward the shed's entrance, pausing only to look back at Morrison, with those impossibly cold eyes. "Thank you for the afternoon's entertainment, Commander. It's been quite some time since I had an audience worthy of my best work." And then she was gone, melting into the desert darkness with the same fluid grace that had characterized all her movements. Morrison stood alone in the weapons shed, surrounded by the detritus of impossible marksmanship, trying to process everything he'd witnessed. The Barrett's cleaning station remained exactly as she'd left it, the hash marks on the leather mat now numbering several dozen more than they had that morning. On the cleaning mat, folded beneath a corner of leather, Morrison found a single sheet of paper. It was torn from her notebook, covered in the same precise handwriting he'd glimpsed earlier, but instead of ballistic calculations or target assessments, it contained a single message written in flowing script. "Some distances can only be measured in lives saved rather than lives taken. The record stands at 3,247 meters, but the real distance was between a little girl's tears and her father's arms. Sometimes the mathematics of love require solutions that exist outside the parameters of what we think we know about physics." Ghost Morrison read the note 3 times before its full meaning penetrated his consciousness. The legendary shot, the 3,247-meter elimination that had made Ghost a legend among snipers, hadn't been about killing an enemy commander or disrupting tactical operations. It had been about saving someone, a child, perhaps, or a family, from something terrible enough to justify the impossible physics of love translated into ballistic precision. He looked out at the desert where heat mirages danced like spirits in the cooling air, and for just a moment he thought he saw a figure moving through the darkness with inhuman grace. But when he blinked, there was nothing there except sand and shadow and the eternal silence of places where legends are born. The ghost was gone, disappeared back into the realm of whispered stories and impossible achievements. But Morrison knew he would carry this day with him for the rest of his life, would dream about the woman who had redefined his understanding of what was humanly possible. He had witnessed something that existed beyond the boundaries of normal experience, had seen capability that challenged the basic laws of physics and probability. And somewhere in the darkness, he knew, Ghost was already calculating her next impossible shot, already planning the next demonstration that some mathematics could only be solved with love, precision, and the absolute certainty that sometimes the distance between heartbreak and hope could be measured in meters, wind drift, and the perfect moment when intention became reality at the speed of sound.